Hi there everyone, Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth. We're here today with Professor Anthony Hall. Sir, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today. You were recently in Tehran, and I want to get your views on some of the, the academia talks that were going on there in Iran. But first of all, for the audience here at home at Press for Truth, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Well, I'm Anthony James Hall, Professor Hall. I'm Professor of Globalization Studies at the University of Lethbridge, where I've been for 25 years. I'm a tenured full professor. I talk about 9/11 in my curricula, in my classes. One of my graduate students, Joshua Blakeney, became quite outspoken on the subject. And my field is history. I founded something called Globalization Studies in 2003. And I've taken my study of the relationship of indigenous peoples to colonial enterprises, to imperialism, to corporate domination, and applied it kind of globally. So I work from the premise that indigenous peoples have been colonized, that the resistance that we're trying to develop, it's really a movement. This movement towards globalization has been going since 1492 in a way. Those who have opposed that imposition, indigenous peoples in the Americas, have a natural role as sort of leaders of this movement as we all deal with the fact that we're being suppressed and made subject to very alien, anti-humanitarian forces.
Now, you're also an author, and do any of these ideas about 9/11 and the issues with the indigenous people come up in some of your books?
Well, as I see it, the wars, the 9/11 wars in the Middle East, in Eurasia, continue a heritage of the Indian Wars, continue a heritage of imperial domination, often this imperial expansionism, whether we're talking about North America or Africa or Asia. It's carried on in the name of civilization's imperative to ascend over savagery. Did you see American Sniper? There's reference to Chris Kyle using the word savagery. Stephen Harper uses it in a recent war propaganda tape. So this idea that we're not doing wars of aggression, we're bringing civilization to savages, we're bringing democracy to backward people, we're battling terrorism. You know, this is a very strong narrative in history. So I've tried to develop a sense of the 9/11 wars as a part of a continuity in history. But there is, it's kind of safe territory to talk about the rise of the American empire. But now we're seeing a new sort of imperial force, Israel, and the global network of people who support Israel and identify with Israeli, could I say, foreign policy as should be the policy of Canada, for instance. Ever since Stephen Harper spoke at the Knesset, we can see this growing reality. As I see it, Canada is in a way being retooled now as a kind of warrior state, modeled after the Israeli warrior state. Maybe even Canada is becoming a servant of the Israeli warrior state. And of course in Tehran, this becomes very clear because after 9/11, there was this thing released called the Axis of Evil, the hit list, which was North Korea, which was Iraq, and at the top of the list is Iran. Iran is a country of 80 million people in the heartland of Eurasia. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been in place since 1979. The Shah of Iran was imposed in 1953 when a elected official by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to nationalize the oil. So this dictator, a puppet dictator, was put in place essentially by the United States and stayed in power until the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So that government has been stable, operative, working, providing some decent arrangement among the complex society which is Iran. It's a theocracy. It runs according to Islamic principles, and so they've hosted conferences over the years, and last September, October, last autumn, I was invited to be one of about 60 people, delegates at this conference in a way, I felt like something like an ambassador from Canada, because in 2012, the government of Canada shut down formal diplomatic relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And John Baird said, you know, Iran is the greatest single threat to world peace and security. Right. I must say that, you know, at the conference in Tehran, there was an atmosphere. I was with some of the best investigative journalists in the world. I got to meet Thierry Masson, who wrote one of the first books on 9/11 in France. I got to meet Wayne Madston. I got to meet Pepe Escobar. And many other people, people in Germany who say, why should our business with Russia or Iran be shut down through these sanctions? We want to have a Eurasian approach to our own interests. I was seeing, you know, very substantial, important discussions on global affairs, and in a much more free kind of atmosphere, ironically, than could be achieved here in North America or in Europe. And of course, the big central subject of the whole conference is 9/11. Right. And I did participate in a session, and I'm proud to say, a discussion on the relationship of Israel to the events of 9/11.
Now, how important is it geopolitically, and why Iran? Talk about it in Iran when it comes to 9/11.
Well, of course, when you're in Iran and you look out at the world, you become aware that there are missiles in Israel pointed at Iran. There is a constant refrain coming from Israeli sources that Iran is a danger, is a menace, it should be bombed, it should be invaded, it should be destroyed, it should be subjected to the same kind of treatment as Iraq. And you remember that with Iraq, there was what we now know to be totally fraudulent building up of this weapons of mass deception. So in Iran, the thing being built up is that Iran is secretly trying to get nuclear weapons, that if they got nuclear weapons, this would destabilize the world. One of the big subjects at the conference, Gareth Porter, wrote a book about the Israeli propaganda to mislead the world about the nature of the Iranian nuclear program. And of course, there's a negotiation taking place on the nuclear program in Iran, which is tied to the fact that they're subject to this barrage of economic warfare right now. Right. So when you're in that context, you become aware that, you know, at the very peak of what's going on geopolitically in the world, there is on the one side, could I call it the Jewish state of Israel, and on the other side, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran is a very functioning, you know, I'd feel much safer in Tehran, for instance, than in Toronto or Vancouver. I mean, it's a very well-managed society. I mean, you know, there are obviously issues and problems, but it was quite revealing to see, you know, the success of that society. So, you know, when you see that level of animosity, where you know, what did George Bush say right after 9/11? He said, you know, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are the axis of evil. You know, we've got to go and counter them. So you suddenly start to see that this 9/11 narrative, who did it and why was it done, this is at the very, you know, center of, well, what story is going to prevail in terms of this relationship between the Jewish state of Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Right. And of course, the Jewish state of Israel has a lot of allies, like our own government. Doesn't necessarily have a lot of, you know, the public support is waning, but at the governmental level, you know, our policies, and it's not only Canada, are very much in line with the idea that Iran is some kind of diabolical society. And the chair of the conference, interestingly, Nader Talebzadeh, he's kind of like the Walter Cronkite of Iran, and he has an extremely popular television show. And so during the course of the conference, we would go down to the other end of the hall and find, you know, a full TV studio with, and I had my turn, and well, I'm live on a show, and I'm told the show is viewed by 10 million people in a country of 80 million people. Maybe it's like television was in the 60s here. And this Nader Talebzadeh is, you know, is an authoritative voice and people in different factions of the government kind of need to get their message out through this television show. And he's a very deeply committed truther, could I say. He's studied it. He is really in close collaboration with Kevin Barrett. And Kevin Barrett, he blogs at Veterans Today, as I do. And he lost his job at the University of Wisconsin because he was teaching about 9/11. He was put on Fox and on Hannity and O'Reilly and pilloried as a sort of unpatriotic person in 2006. He has since then had Truth Jihad radio show, and he's very, very up to date on the latest things. And because he's Muslim, because it is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and at this conference the imams did have an important role. He does have a kind of a inside view of things and is listened to by the government. So this axis between Kevin Barrett and Nader Talebzadeh is very important. So I think the truth movement, it's important to grapple with the reality that as we develop, there's a new geopolitical role developing with this 9/11 narrative. And it's very, it will have a lot of impact on the future of Israel, the future of the Islamic Republic. And we need to be sophisticated about that. And whereas in the past, there was a time in the truth movement where I think there was a certain logic to say, look, all we need to do is point out that the story we've been told is incorrect, right, that the evidence doesn't support that story, and we have like David Ray Griffin writing 10 books to demonstrate that the official story is wrong. But as the years go by, well then, if it wasn't those people who did it, who did it? And some people will still not go into that narrative, but others will go into it, and those who do go into it tend to come up with a conclusion that somehow Israel, the foreign policy of Israel, Mossad, worldwide Zionism, that there's something there that is very central to it. And when you see who benefited from it and who is using this narrative, it's pretty obvious that even in Stephen Harper's policies, that he came to power based on this specious account of 9/11. His political clique depends on that narrative. So it's kind of a bit stretching it to go to Parliament and say, study this now.
Well, what has the reaction been in Iran to these types of ideas? I know recently a vicar came out speaking about possible Israeli involvement in 9/11, and are they suppressing the freedom of speech because he just said this on a Facebook post?
Well, now, of course, this is big news in Iran. It's interesting after being sort of put on the side because you do 9/11 here, but in Iran, this is a mainstream thing, and people are very interested in this story.
Well, the former president came out in support of 9/11 truth, did he not?
Ahmadinejad came out in support, and of course Rouhani, who is the new elected president, he's seen as more moderate, more Western-oriented, more friendly to the United States and such. But obviously, this conference happened under his auspices. Now, at the conference, I did meet Reverend Steven Sizer, and Steven Sizer is a vicar in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which has 80 million members, and of course the Church of England is a big part of the Protestant Reformation, and the Church of England has a very progressive wing, and Reverend Sizer has been very outspoken in favor of, for instance, boycotts, divestment and sanctions, BDS, based on the premise that Israel is an apartheid state. And he has been outspoken in defense of Palestinian human rights, and he's an academic expert in the field of Christian Zionism, and he's written 2 books about it. So at the conference, I think he was, in a sense, new to much of the narrative on 9/11. And you know, I did speak to him about it. Ken O'Keefe, who you will know of him, and you know, he's very prominent in Iran, and he was at the conference. And Kevin Barrett and I and Reverend Sizer spent a couple of hours talking 9/11 and 9/11 issues. And lo and behold, he puts on his Facebook page the Wiki Spooks article. It's just simply, you know, posting one of, you know, a large number of posts on Israel and 9/11. You know, it's become quite a big subject on the internet, a sub-subject within the larger 9/11 discourse. And so he puts this on his site, and the next thing you know, he's being identified by something called the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which work very closely with BBC. And there's the Vice President, Jonathan R Kush. Jonathan R Kush smears him, and he's been on Reverend Sizer's case because of his pro-Palestinian, pro-human rights for Palestinian stance. And so he's jumped upon. Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League has now joined, saying, you know, this is an affront, and that we should have somebody in the Church of England actually accusing Jews of doing it, and this is the way it's put. No, this is not an accusation against Jews generically to say Mossad is involved or certain neocons are involved, and many of these neocons are Israeli Americans, like literally with dual passports. It's a very different thing to say generically, you know, lots of truthers are Jewish people. And
it seems that anti-Semitism is often just thrown around as a way to just silence and shut people down.
Well, one of the very interesting things about coming out of the conference was that we were smeared for being at the conference. It was called a hate fest. And the Anti-Defamation League puts out 4 words. And it was interesting to see these 4 words sort of grouped. So it's anti-Semitic, conspiracy theorist, Holocaust denial, and 9/11 truther. So these terms are all grouped. And, you know, the code becomes, well, he's studying 9/11, she's studying 9/11. It must be a conspiracy theorist. A conspiracy theorist is a code for a Holocaust denier. So these 4 terms, to see these 4 terms the way they're just invoked like some kind of magic spell, and once somebody gets tarred or feathered with any one of these terms, then sort of all of them apply. And to see 9/11 truth sort of put in that category, I see it as a sort of achievement in a way, that it's become so threatening to the narrative. So Reverend Sizer's, just by merely questioning, by posting, you know, an item on his Facebook page, has become a target of severe attack, and the Church of England itself has said that they're going to do an investigation. And so what is the Church of England, what is its policy? I mean, we've seen the United Kingdom government become, you know, join the United States, join in the invasion of Iraq. We've seen Tony Blair, you know, who is a Christian Zionist and a credibly accused war criminal. So, you know, I've written about this in Veterans Today. I was interviewed by Nader the other day, and I can say that this is a moving story. This isn't done yet. And, you know, it does present an entry point. Like, why is it that if you simply ask questions, you're pilloried? What about Jonathan Kay and his defense of Israel and his attack of truthers in his anthropology of the underground conspiracists in his book called Among the Truthers? To my way of thinking, this is, you know, this is reprehensible to medicalize people, to say basically, you know, I'm not going to argue the facts here. We're dealing with a group of sick people, and we have to inoculate our young people against those people. Well, it happens that the funding agency for Jonathan Kay, who's an editor at the National Post and is, you know, very high-profile journalist in Canada, that the funding for that came from an agency called the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And you find the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies working with Congress in the United States to develop the legislation for sanctions against Iran. And the word sanctions, I think, is a polite way to say economic warfare against Iran. And you say, well, why is it that this particular constituency has such a vested interest in protecting, this narrative, this story? So the drama of what's going to be the future of the Church of England, this is contained in this Reverend Sizer story.
Right. Where do you see all this going from here in regards to Iran's future, especially when dealing with the topic of 9/11 and just in the next, few months or even years from now? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I look at Iran, it's kind of on death row. I mean, the bottom line position of the government of Israel is, some way or other we have to topple that government. We have to destroy that country. And, there does seem to be a sort of divide and conquer approach to the Muslim world, to the Arab world, and of course people in Iran are Persian, so the Arab and Persian world that, the dominant scenario is, let's break up Syria, let's break up Iraq. Some see Daesh or ISIL or ISIS as a kind of constructed, concocted army to replace the CIA constructed Al-Qaeda, that the war on terror is kind of being rebranded. And of course the, moving towards the invasion and takeover of Iran involves breaking up Syria. And Syria, of course, is backed by Russia. And, so these sanctions targeting Iran are also targeting Russia. And Russia is being set up as a kind of demon. So when you say what's going to happen, like, this is not a spectator sport. This is our lives, bro. I mean, this is it's up to us, really. And how the audience that we have here, the fact that there is a minority of people who are conscious enough to be able to look beyond the headlines in the newspaper and the 6 o'clock news. A lot depends on us right now.
Yeah. Well, we're getting to that point where we're starting to reach that potential breaking point where you wake up the masses, say to the tune of about 10% of them who start to understand these ideas, then we could reach that turning point that, moves us towards more liberty. Thank you for taking some time to discuss it with us today.
Thank you.